In a town of just 200 souls, we had 3 churches. But they did nothing when the fire came. We stood there, shouting, praying, as the flames leapt from house to house, but we received no answer, neither from heaven nor earth. Our fire department had vanished as people moved away, and the town sunk deeper into debt. Over the last decade, we clung to the hope of gap funding to carry us through the next fiscal year. But the November fire was burning that hope away before our eyes. Desperate, we turned to the only option left: the collective entity. It was my idea. I was one of the 4 recent college graduates who had come back to Melinda after escaping. The rest of the town didn't even consider it. Our town's only claim to fame was electing Melinda Elizabeth Benteen as mayor long ago, accused of witchcraft. Instead of burning her at the stake, they kept her artifacts in the mayoral building. One of those artifacts was a scroll from 1880. I'd memorized the strange, looping text as a child, enchanted by its forbidden nature. I shattered the glass case with a rock, took the scroll in my hands, and ran back to Turkeyfoot Avenue where the townsfolk debated our slim chances. The debate was brief. The old-timers still whispered Benteen's name with unease, but those younger, like me, were willing to try anything. Melinda Benteen hadn't been a witch in the usual sense. She didn't claim to commune with Satan or demons. No, she dealt in a darker, more human power, raw energy, the power of will. According to the scroll, if we all placed our hands in a specific pattern, creating a lattice of flesh, and focused our thoughts as one, we could pour our strength into an entity born from us. So we stood, firelight licking at our backs in the middle of Turkeyfoot Avenue, our hands overlapping in the strange configuration described. It had to work. It needed to work. That night, I saw fear in the eyes of my neighbors, fear I had never understood until then. For once, I felt a connection to this place. Like the others, I dreamt of escape, but I had never found the means. My life was on the line just as much as theirs. We poured our will into the ritual, and I felt something flow through my arm. The lattice of our hands began to glow, faint at first, a pulsing, eerie light snaking through our joined limbs. It grew stronger as it reached the front of the formation. Old Man McCree, standing at the point, gasped as the energy surged through him, erupting from his chest like a beam. He crumpled to the ground, but none of us moved to help him. We were transfixed by the glowing figure rising from the midst of our circle. "Focus on the fire," I shouted. "Think about the fire." As one, we willed our creation forward. It rose, shimmering, taking form, flowing white robes, a golden halo, a face that almost looked kind. It hovered above the burning houses, spreading wings that gleamed like ivory in the firelight. Rain began to pour not from the sky, but from beneath its wings, a cold, unearthly drizzle. Slowly, the inferno dimmed, the flames shrinking to embers, then fading to darkness. We watched in disbelief as the creature we had called into being hovered above the ruined town, rain falling from its spectral form. It had worked. Somehow, it had worked. "I've seen something like this before," I whispered, recalling the ghostly warrior on the Turkeyfoot Creek Bridge when I was 10. But this was different. It was power we controlled, power we summoned. "It's an angel," murmured one of the older women, eyes wide. Exactly how I imagined it. "An angel," others echoed, but the word felt wrong in my mouth. I watched the shape, its form shifting unnaturally in the air, something deeper and darker behind that serene face. The other college grads and I rushed to Old Man McCree, sprawled on the ground. He was alive, but his hair stood straight, crackling with static. He blinked up at us with wild eyes and muttered that he was fine, but the unease in his gaze lingered. We left him there, all too aware of the creature hovering above us, its wings casting shadows that danced like the flames they had just extinguished. But as the rain continued to fall, cold and relentless, I couldn't help but wonder what we had truly brought into this world, and what it might demand from us next. The sky over our town had gone dark again, the heat from the fire fading into a biting chill that crept through the streets. One by one, the townsfolk trickled away, leaving just the four of us, Ryan, Lily, Courtney, and me, to wander over to the Copper Bar and Grill. We slid into a booth, the air between us thick with the silence of disbelief. The bartender arrived shortly after, pale and tight-lipped. He poured our drinks without a word before slipping into the shadows of the back room. Ryan, a loudmouth meathead since our K-12 days, sat across from me, his usual bluster drowned in the bottom of his glass. He just stared into the swirling amber of his beer, not saying a word. Lily, our town's resident goth and eternal outsider, had never fit in with the town's rigid ways, but even she had joined in the ritual. Her father's house had been next in line for the flames. It had been saved. She broke the silence, her voice a jagged whisper. How the hell did that actually work? I had no answers. Neither did Courtney, who had moved to town late in high school, a transplant whose roots never sank deep before college took her away again. She leaned forward, her voice barely audible. "It's this town," she said, glancing around the dimly lit bar, as if the shadows might hear. Something like that would never have worked in a big city. But you got every single person here to join in. That's impossible anywhere else. I nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling like a stone in my chest. Yeah, so no one would ever believe us, even if we told them. She looked down, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. Ryan's head lifted slowly, but he hadn't heard us. His eyes gleamed with a feverish light as he spoke. "This is it," he murmured. "This is how we fix things." Lily turned to him, frowning. "What are you talking about?" "We do it again," he insisted, his voice gaining strength. "Plow fields, grow crops, save the town." "Forget farming," she shot back, leaning in. "We could do something real with this. Build a factory, sell electric cars, anything modern." Their argument erupted like a storm, voices rising over the dim clinking of glasses and the occasional rumble of wind outside. Courtney and I exchanged a look, one of unease, unspoken, but mirrored in our expressions. It settled deep in my gut, twisting there as the night dragged on. By morning, that unease had curdled into dread. The entire town had gathered on Turkeyfoot Avenue again, but not to fight the flames. This time, they were arguing, shouting over one another, a seething mass of desperation and hope. At the center of it all stood Mr. Ellis, the bank owner, arms spread wide, trying to impose order on the chaos. "Listen," he bellowed, his voice barely carrying over the din. "We can work together and get something done, or we can fight and end up with nothing." But the shouting only grew louder. The churchgoers, divided into three camps, argued over their own visions for the entity. Farmers like Ryan and his father demanded that it be used to restore their crops. Lily's crowd wanted something new, something that would drag the town into the modern age. Beside me, Courtney called out, her voice clear and steady amidst the clamor. "Do we really want such different things? Don't we all just want to live peacefully and prosper? Why can't we do all of it?" Ellis seized on her words, pointing towards her. "Good idea. Someone get a table, paper, and a pencil." A shout came from the crowd. "If we're gonna do this officially, we should use a pen." Ellis nodded, exasperated. Fine, somebody grab a pen." But when a man from the crowd handed over a pen with the logo of Trinity Lutheran, another voice growled, "Hey, that's not fair. What about Melissa Memorial United Methodist?" Ellis pressed a hand to his forehead, his patience fraying. "Does anyone have a pen without any logos or words on it?" I watched my three new companions at my side as they dragged a table from a nearby house, setting it in the middle of the cracked pavement. The argument stretched on, voices growing hoarse under the fading autumn sun. They spent hours debating the order in which each group would get their turn, with the entity hours of sharp, angry words that cut through the chilled air like knives. As dusk fell, they finally reached an agreement, a brittle peace settling over the gathered crowd. They crafted a plan, one that all 200 of us could accept, a vision cobbled together from desperation and hope. And as the shadows deepened and night took hold, I felt something shift in the air. Something watching from just beyond the circle of light cast by the town's meager street lamps. We had our agreement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had made a bargain with something beyond our understanding. Something that lurked in the darkness, waiting to see what we'd offer next. At first, it seemed like a wonder. When night fell and the darkness settled in, the entity didn't need our summons to return. It reappeared in the sky, drifting above us, different this time, dimmer, as if the fire had taken its toll. But it was still there. That was our first real test. Ellis, his voice tired but steady, read from the newly drafted charter. The first miracle would be to heal Old Man McCree's ailing dog. The poor creature had been on its last legs since his wife's death the year before, and McCree himself had taken a fall just the night before. It seemed fair kind even. All 200 of us gathered, raising our hands and offering our support. Little sparks of pale energy left each of us, floating upward to feed the entity in the sky, which grew brighter with each offering. Then, with a flash like an umbrella opening, the light shot down over McCree's house. A few moments later, the dog burst through the flap in the door, bounding like a puppy, tail wagging furiously. It raced straight into McCree's arms, its illness gone as if it had never been. McCree fell to his knees, weeping, thanking us over and over. It was a sight that warmed the heart. But as the crowd dispersed and we drifted back to our little cliques, the warmth began to fade, leaving behind a creeping chill. We found ourselves back at the Copper Bar, each of us with a drink, but the exhaustion settled in like a second skin. At first, I thought it was just the weight of the day's arguments, but when I glanced around, I saw the same hollow weariness in my friends' faces. Courtney broke the silence, voicing what we all felt. Man, giving that energy away really took it out of me, huh? It was a red flag, a glaring warning, but we ignored it. For the next few nights, we gathered again, fixing the damage left by the fire. Each night, we'd trudge back to the bar afterward, but our exhaustion grew deeper. After a week of these small miracles, I couldn't keep up. I left early, went straight home, and collapsed into bed. But even then, I woke with a pounding head like a hangover without the alcohol. When I stumbled out onto my porch the next morning, there was Courtney, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee. Her face was drawn, shadows etched beneath her eyes. "We've got a problem," she said, voice brittle against the early morning air. I nodded, clutching the warmth of the cup. We walked in silence to Turkeyfoot Avenue, where the others were already gathered. They looked worse than we did, older faces sunken and pale, as if drained by the very act of living. Mr. Ellis stood in the center, his eyes dull with exhaustion, but he managed a weary smile when he saw us. "Ah, there you are. Kids, you might look better than the rest of us, but you're feeling it too, aren't you?" His voice was hoarse, barely cutting through the murmured complaints of the crowd. We nodded, definitely. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Well, it's no mystery. Every time we give to the angel, it takes a piece of us. It's not free. We need to figure out a payment plan." Some of the older folks peeled away at that, but Ellis pressed on, his eyes settling on us with a kind of grim resolve. "Look, you younger ones bounce back faster than the rest of us. It's hitting you hard now, but you'll recover quicker. So we're asking you to take on a little more." Courtney's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "How about you quit the quick stop?" he said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "Just focus on resting up, eating right, getting stronger. You'll still be working, just for the town, not for yourselves." I couldn't believe it. "You're asking us to quit our jobs?" Ellis didn't even blink. "You'd still be working. But it's for the greater good, not a paycheck." I wanted to snap back at him, but then Lily and Ryan arrived, their faces drawn with the same weariness, and Ellis gave them the same pitch. When I got home, ready to vent my anger, My parents undercut me with unexpected pride. "Ellis called us," they said, smiling with tired eyes. "We're so proud of what you're doing for the town. We'll support you until this miracle year is done." I had no choice but to agree, and for a time, it almost seemed to work. My days became a strict regimen of running, lifting weights, eating carefully balanced meals, preparing myself to give more of my energy to the entity. I got stronger, fitter. But as dusk fell, every evening, the ritual drained me. A basketball-sized orb of white light would siphon away a piece of my strength, leaving me shaking, gasping for breath. The older folks still gave too, but their offerings were smaller, no bigger than tennis balls, even cherries. And in return, we witnessed miracles. Buildings rising from the ground in seconds, fields flourishing out of barren soil. People clapped us on the back, cheered, called us heroes. But as winter faded into March, the tasks grew larger, and the entity's hunger grew with them. I returned home each night, weak and hollowed out, alternating between chugging Gatorade and retching into the sink, my body rebelling against the toll I paid. I hid my struggle from my parents, from my friends. But every night, as I lay shivering in my bed, I felt the edges of my mind fray a little more. And all the while, the entity hovered above our town, bright and unblinking, like an eye that watched without pity. It felt like I was trapped in a prison without walls, hemmed in by invisible bars. The night came when I couldn't take it anymore. I had to give up. My hands shook as I admitted defeat, barely able to meet the other's eyes. Prosperity had become a habit to everyone else, a crutch they leaned on. Beside me, Courtney clutched her sides, nodding silently. She too was ready to break free. But Ryan's father held tight to his son's arm, his grip like iron. "We've pushed back the miracle nights for emergencies too many times," he growled. "The fields need fertilizing. They can't be left to dry out." "It's fine," Ellis announced to the gathering, his voice smooth but cold. "We can all give a little more when needed, right?" He looked around, trying to rouse agreement. But their faces were pale and drawn. No one had the strength left to offer. That night, they got the Monday miracle done, but it hollowed out the older folks, leaving them bedridden, too drained to even leave their homes the next day. It was like they hadn't realized how much of themselves they'd given away. Strangely, that made them more desperate. They clung tighter to the rituals, as if refusing to see what it was costing us. And even as I felt a little strength return to my limbs, I saw their sickness, their confusion, their anger. "Don't you get it?" I tried to shout over their fury. "Can't you see what this is doing to us?" But they didn't want to hear it. "You're just whining." Old Man McCree snarled, spittle flying. The crowd turned on us, their faces twisted in ugly scorn. Widow Stevens spat in Courtney's direction. "Lazy piece of crap," she hissed. Courtney, usually the calmest among us, snapped. She thrust her hand forward, middle finger raised. "Fine, screw you, we're done. We're not giving anything anymore." Ryan's eyes went wide with panic, and he edged closer to us. "Come on guys, my family still needs a few more miracles." I glared at him, my voice low with disgust. "Funny how those miracles are spaced out just right to suit your farm, huh? Almost like they planned it that way, to keep you on their side." He went silent, lips pressed into a thin line, and Ellis's face twisted with a strange, malicious satisfaction. "I didn't want to do this," he said softly. Then he motioned to the town's 2 cops, who began to close in on us. "Seriously?" I yelled, my voice cracking as Courtney Lily, and I backed away. "You're going to do this? This is insane. The town needs these miracles," Ellis barked. His face was wild, eyes bulging. "If we stop, everything falls apart. You're endangering everyone with your selfishness." I scanned the faces around me, hoping for even a flicker of doubt. But all I saw was anger, red-hot and mindless. My own parents glared at me from the crowd, their eyes lit with a fervor I'd never seen. It felt like a betrayal so deep it cut into my bones. I glanced at Courtney and Lily. The town had made one mistake in their desperate calculations. They'd made us stronger. We turned and ran, faster than they could have imagined. The cops gave chase, but their shouts grew faint behind us. By the time they reached their car, we were already deep in the woods, shadows swallowing us whole. We broke into an empty house, stuffing bags with whatever supplies we could find, clothes, food, a few grimy blankets. And then we vanished into the forest, hiding among the trees, watching from a distance as dusk fell. Our first fear was retribution. We kept waiting for the entity to track us down, to burn through the woods like a scythe. But that night, as they gathered to summon it for punishment, the light in the sky darkened, not dimmed, but turned a sickly, ashen gray. It hung there, no longer bright and blinding but dull and sullen, like a storm cloud that had forgotten how to rain. Panic rippled through the town like a fever. They rushed back to the charter, stumbling through the old rituals, praying that the entity would brighten again. But no matter how many hands they raised, no matter how much energy they poured into the sky, the figure remained dim, its glow cold and empty. And in that darkness, the town changed. Where once there had been a sleepy scattering of homes and churches, now it felt like a place under siege. They organized search parties, combing the woods for us at night. At first, they just used flashlights, but soon they carried rifles, their voices brittle with fear. The first time they almost found us, we thought it was the end. But instead, we learned what had become of the town. Old Man McCree stumbled upon us while we were scavenging food from his porch. His hands shook as he offered us what little he had, his eyes wide with terror. "Listen," he whispered, voice breaking. "They've started giving your work to others, to those who can barely stand. When they try to refuse, they lock them up." I tried to speak up, and they killed my dog, burned my house down. His words shook with a brittle desperation, and we knew then that whatever was left of our town wasn't something we recognized anymore. It had become a place where fear had settled into every shadow, and the entity in the sky watched it all, indifferent and gray. The town had broken itself for a taste of power, and now it was devouring its own. Our resistance began in whispers and shadows. We set up our hideout in Old Man McCree's basement, hidden from the patrols that now scoured the woods with rifles and flashlights. From there, we began sneaking through town under the cover of night, seeking out those who still remembered what life had been like before. We found Ryan by June 1st. He was a gaunt, haunted thing, a mere stick figure of the loud-mouthed meathead I remembered. All the fight seemed drained out of him, like the energy he'd given had left him hollow. "Come on," Lily urged him through a broken window, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're gonna fix this, but we need you on the inside." Ryan nodded, weak and shaky. Blood seeped suddenly from his nose, staining his shirt. That night, we watched the ritual unfold from the shadows of McCree's attic. The entity, once a brilliant, glowing figure, now hovered above the gathering in blackened robes, its face twisted into a sneer, cold and disdainful. Two armed guards propped Ryan up on unsteady legs, his offering a sickly orb of gray light the size of a car. He collapsed as it left him, and the guards dragged him away like dead weight, along with several other skeletal old men and women. Their so-called miracle that night: a brand new bank building rising out of the earth like a tombstone. Ellis called it an emergency measure, but we saw it for what it was, a symbol of his tightening grip on the town's throat. The next morning, 3 emaciated men and a woman, all hollow-eyed, met us at our hideout deep in the woods. Ryan had told them we needed help, and they came, even though their bodies were worn down to almost nothing. From them, we learned the patrol's schedule, when the shifts changed, when their eyes would be weakest. That night, we staged our first ambush, lying in wait behind tangled roots and overgrown bushes. It wasn't a battle, more like a desperate scuffle. The patrols were only dangerous because of the guns they carried, not the strength of their arms. But while we grew stronger, Ellis's influence only deepened. Each night, he took more energy, more lives, leaving his followers skeletal and gasping, but still fiercely loyal. He used their dwindling life force to buy more guns, more weapons. By August, the nightly gatherings had turned into fortress rituals, guarded by armed men and thick barricades. We could no longer even approach close enough to see the twisted form of the angel hovering over the ceremonies. On the 5th of August, they took my parents. Once, they'd been loyal supporters, but the town had turned on them, just as it had turned on us. As our interference grew bolder, the ranks of the desperate had swelled. Half of the town had grown angry and aligned with our cause, while the rest clung to Ellis's promises, too scared to let go. I was ready to give up, convinced we had no chance against the weapons and the power Ellis wielded. But Courtney, eyes fierce with a strange, unyielding light, promised me she'd end it, even if it meant her death. Everything came to a boiling point on the 7th of August. It was a night so hot, the air itself seemed to shimmer with menace. Sweat slicked my skin as I crouched behind the crumbling marble columns of one of Ellis's new miracles, watching the scene unfold below. He had my parents tied to poles in the center of Turkeyfoot Avenue, the place where we'd once gathered as a town to summon something beautiful. Now he held an assault rifle, its barrel swinging back and forth like a pendulum between them. "I know you're out there, you little shits," he shouted, his voice a rasp against the still air. "Come out and fight like men." We waited. According to our contact, he'd given the same challenge the past 2 nights, desperation fraying his words. He didn't know we were already there, hidden among the buildings he'd made too grand and sprawling to defend properly. We crouched behind stone palisades and beneath the shadow of spires, eyes trained on him. "Come forth, angel," he bellowed, lifting his arms to the sky. The entity responded, unfurling in the air above him. Courtney's hand clamped down on my wrist, her grip like iron. Across the street, I saw Lily, face drained of color, blending into the darkness. The figure that emerged was no longer the radiant being we had once called upon. Its feathered wings had withered, curling into leathery, bat-like appendages. A crown of twisted horns ringed its head, casting jagged shadows down its skeletal face. Its eyes, once warm and guiding, now glowed a dull, sickly red, like embers in a dying fire. It hung above the town, a harbinger of all we had twisted and broken. And then, its gaze turned downward, locking onto us. The demon's face twisted in fury, its expression a mask of hatred, and waves of searing heat radiated from it, warping the air around it. It turned the night into a furnace, and we could feel the sweat pooling on our skin. What had once been a radiant entity was now a twisted creature, our doing, our creation, though none of them could see the change. They'd been too close, too eager to believe in the miracles. But for those of us who had been away, it was as clear as a blade against skin. It's time to end this pathetic little rebellion once and for all. It bellowed, its voice rolling through the town like thunder. Below, the townsfolk bound in chains and ropes strained to give what little energy they had left. The guards beat the contributions out of them, forcing out sparks of dim gray and black light, barely flickering as they floated upward, vanishing into the demon's maw. I turned to Ryan, crouching in the darkness beside me, little more than a skeleton now. I whispered, "Come on, Ryan, you've got this. I know you do." I could only hope there was still some fight in him. Deep down, he had always been a good man. From the shadows, we watched as something new emerged from his chest, a light that was not gray or white, but a deep, pulsating red, blood red. It formed a ball, throbbing with life, expanding beyond measure, and I knew that he was giving all he had left. As the orb of crimson light left him, he crumpled to the dirt, lifeless. The demon absorbed it, the red energy seeping into its monstrous form, and it let out an ear-splitting howl, writhing in pain. They're here!" Ellis shouted, gesturing wildly at the demon. "Burn them out!" But the red light did something Ellis hadn't expected. A slow, creeping rot began to spread across the demon's body, starting at its fingers, burning away its form from within. Not the purifying fire Ellis had hoped for, but something far worse. With a furious roar, the demon raised its other arm bloated with muscle and clenched its fist. The house nearest the square exploded in a burst of flames, a massive pillar of fire shooting into the night sky. Heat scorched our faces even from a distance, forcing us to retreat further into the shadows of a nearby alley. "Can it do that again?" Courtney whispered, voice shaking. Normally, there had only ever been one miracle each night, but this was different. Destruction came more easily to the demon now than creation ever had. It raised its fist once more, and the building across the street erupted into a storm of cinders, scattering debris and embers like meteors across the town square. I grabbed Courtney, holding her back as she sobbed and tried to run for Lily, who had been too close, crushed under the falling rubble, a twisted shape half buried in the smoldering ruins. "They're dead, Courtney," I hissed, trying to keep my own voice from breaking. "We have to move now, or we're all done for." She wiped the tears from her face with a bloodied hand and nodded grimly. She was right. We couldn't wait any longer. Even though we were outnumbered, we'd all die if this continued. I gave the signal, and our ragtag army of elderly townsfolk surged into the square from every side. The explosion that killed Lily had also knocked several guards to the ground, dazed and groaning, and those at our feet dropped their weapons without a fight. Further back, Ellis's more loyal men opened fire, but none of us were hit. We had been prepared to charge into the slaughter and die fighting, but instead, our circle of old men and women slowed, lowering their guns as the enemy faltered. The shots fired into the air, more for show than anything else, as the guards hesitated. "Do it!" Ellis screamed, turning on his own men, kicking and striking them. Kill them all. They're threatening everything we've built." We all paused, looking at each other as the demon above writhed in agony, struggling against the red rot that gnawed at its form. One of its arms had dissolved completely, leaving it hunched and twisted, its torso beginning to disintegrate from the inside out. "It's over," Courtney shouted, her voice ringing through the smoke and chaos. "We made that thing to save this town, to put out fires, not to burn it all down." She gestured wildly to the flaming ruins around us. "Who cares about your riches if there's nothing left to live in?" Ellis's face twisted into a snarl. "I don't give a damn," he roared, dragging my mother forward as a shield. "I'll take what's mine and leave. To hell with all of you." He backed away, pulling her along, as guns began to rise again, pointed at him this time. My heart pounded in my chest, fingers trembling on the trigger of my pistol. But it wasn't me who fired first. Courtney, steely-eyed and resolute, squeezed off a shot, catching Ellis in the shoulder. He staggered, firing blindly, but her second shot found its mark in his gut. He collapsed to the ground, bleeding out, gasping for breath. She spat at him, fury written across her face. "Anyone can learn to aim." My mother stumbled free, and the guards cut the ropes binding her and my father. They ran to me, and I held them close, held my family for the first time in what felt like forever. Above us, the demon was half the size it had been, its body crumbling as the red light ate away at its essence. Leaving my parents to the care of the others, I ran to Courtney. She knelt in the ashes, her breath coming in ragged gasps, blood pooling beneath her, but her eyes were locked on the disintegrating creature above. "We can end this," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. And even as the darkness closed in around us, I believed her. Ellis was dying, crumpled in the dirt, blood seeping through his fingers as he clutched his wounds. I knelt beside him, my own face streaked with tears, shaking my head in disbelief. "It didn't have to be like this," I whispered, voice cracking. "Why did it end like this?" Ellis let out a bitter laugh, a sound rough with pain. His mouth twisted, a grimace bearing red-stained teeth. "You know, kid, I don't even know anymore," he rasped. "I was content before all this." He coughed, a thick spurt of blood trailing down his chin. I didn't want more until I had a taste of it. Courtney's hand was already slipping from mine, her breaths coming shallow and labored. But something twisted inside me, and I reached out to grab Ellis's hand too. I clutched both, feeling the life ebb from them. In a desperate cry, I turned my head and shouted into the smoke-filled night, "Somebody get the parts, man. We'll make a new collective entity. We can save them. We have to save them." But both Courtney and Ellis, gasping for air, shook their heads, a shared understanding passing between them. They knew what I couldn't. Not yet. Not fully. I understand a piece of it now, months later. But I never will. Not completely. There's a part of me that remains lost in that moment, in the town square, holding their hands as they went cold. I stayed there until dawn, until the demon above us crumbled to ash, its last red embers fading away with the first light of morning. My parents stood nearby, looking on with eyes heavy with guilt and regret, but they kept their distance, not daring to interrupt my silent rage and grief. As daylight spilled over the ruined town, those who still had homes left began hammering up for sale signs, one after another, until every door had one. The town emptied, like breath leaving a corpse. We each left, scattering to different places, because there was nothing left to say. Trust had splintered beyond repair. There's still a place on the map called Humble, Ohio, but it's not the same. The name remains, the buildings still stand, and the land rolls on like it always did. But my home is gone, buried beneath the ashes of what we tried to build. In the end, I suppose it had to happen, better a memory, painful and bitter, than a living nightmare that would have never stopped. Beware what you build together. The better angels of our nature don't always stay that way. Sometimes they turn into something much darker.